Hello and welcome. In this video, I'll be commentating a time-lapse of some more detailed blockout work I've been doing over the past week for this Golem character. This video is part of a series I'm doing as an overview of the whole process. From where I left off last video, I was just grouping the different parts of the Golem in collections for better organization. I find that pausing to tidy stuff up occasionally stops my file from becoming a mess. After tidying up, I moved on to the second pass of the character's head. Its head is broken up into these smaller blocks that are kind of cobbled around in a ring formation. I started with basic cubes and I made sure they're roughly the same size and shape as the blocks. Then I used bevels and extrusions to try and match the shapes a bit more closely. It took me a few tries to get one of the blocks to look right. I say this a lot, but it's easy to get absorbed staring at orthographic views without checking other angles. Since this model will be used for a 3D print, it needs to look good at all angles. Once I finished the second pass on the head, I hid it away so I could focus on the upper torso. While it's generally the right shape, there's some interesting details like the thick rim that overlaps the golem's abdomen. I rebuilt the shape again with a subdivided cube, this time around focusing on getting the ridge to look right. I also took the whole shape and created an edge loop so I could inset it from the bottom, allowing the abdomen to actually socket in. After this, I used a cylinder to boolean out a chunk of the mesh for the left arm to attach to the torso. The abdomen is actually pretty straightforward cylindrical shape with these interesting runic shapes that have been bas-reliefed out of it. To block out those shapes, I just used NURBS curves. I then used the bevel option to turn the curves into geometry with controllable thickness. For now, they'll remain this way, but when I move on to sculpting, I'm likely to fuse them to the center with remeshing. Looking at the legs, they're way more cylindrical and boxy, so I decided to redo them using edge loops, extrusions, and insets to trace the shape. I redid the shin in the same way, using a cylinder. The shin presents a pretty interesting shape, a kind of stony ball socket joint. I kind of overcomplicated this problem by making some cuts and extruding edges out. On the left leg, I use a much simpler, better method that I'll go over when we get to that. The shape of these little knee plates is kind of confusing to me, so I went with a more of an approximation of the shape instead of trying to recreate it exactly. At this point, I had to really closely examine the way that the toes and heel are fused with the bottom of the shin. The shin almost feels like a stump with chunks cut out of it to make space for the toes and the heel. So I used the grease pencil tool to rough out the cuts I would need to make. Then I just used basic cubes to boolean out the shin. This messed up the topology pretty bad, which again isn't that important since I'll be remeshing this model. But remeshing doesn't work well when vertices are twisting inside out or creating gaps, so I just made sure to clean stuff like that up before moving on. I also tried to clean up a few Eng Gons. An Eng Gon is basically a plane with more than 4 corners. If the plane is actually flat and doesn't deform, then this doesn't really create any problems. But if the verts all have different depths, you'll get a really funky, impossible shape, which I think also causes issues in remeshing. After cleaning up those cuts, I started sketching and blocking out the heel. The shin has an interesting outcropping that seems to shield the golem's big toe, so I made some cuts and extruded geo out of that to match it. After this, I blocked out the 3 toes from cubes. I find myself using Blender's grease pencil a lot to help me work out what primitives to use and what tools to use to get what I want. After blocking out the final toe, I started tweaking overall sizes of each toe to make them fit into their sockets a bit better. I don't have reference for the soles of the feet yet, but my general idea is that the toes and the rest of the foot aren't attached. I think that means that this golem can wiggle its toes. I mirrored the legs temporarily as a placeholder, and I began working on the left leg later in the week. The upper thigh was fine just being mirrored, but I felt the shin was different enough to justify modeling it from scratch. This time around, I had a much better plan for my approach to create the socket. I just used an inset and selected faces that lined up with the ridges in the reference image. This made a much cleaner, better looking result in my opinion. I also opted to manually make cuts for the toes instead of using booleans. I also extruded an Eng Gon up the center of the mesh to make it hollow on the inside. I decided to go back on this decision later, opting for something else. While examining the back of the left shin, I noticed a pretty large crack that made room for the heel. I decided to use an actual grease pencil layer so I could sketch the contours of this crack in 3 dimensions instead of just 2. I faffed about entirely too long getting the grease pencil set up the way I needed it, but once I finished that, it did actually help me judge where to make knife cuts in the cylinder. I didn't cut through the whole mesh properly, so being lazy, I just took the faces created by my cuts, separated them, and thickened them out to use as another bool cutter so I could cut through the inner and outer side of the hollow cylinder. After making that cut, I did more cleanup just to appease the remesher when it comes to that step. It was around this time that I realized I didn't want the shin to be hollow, so I closed faces to fix that. After that, I started working on the heel and the toes. I practically did the same thing here as I did on the right leg, sketching out basic shapes to get an idea, then actually blocking those out with primitives. I also wanted to make sure that the bottoms of the toes were relatively level with the floor, so I unhid the stand I modeled to use as a reference point for that. At this point, I do a little more cleanup, making sure to name all the mesh pieces appropriately. Finally, I get to remodeling the pelvis. My original blockout was looking a bit static and boring compared to how dynamic the sketch was. I think it's because the angles are a lot more sheer in the sketch, so I started tweaking the original to match that more closely. I mirrored the shape briefly while getting the shape figured out. Then I inset it and applied the mirror so I could tweak the model asymmetrically. Now that everything was done, I decided that I could tweak the golem's pose to feel a little more balanced. I like that it looks like it's lurching forward, but it kinda looks like it's gonna fall over. So I tweaked the rotation of its legs to make it squat a bit. And that's about it for the blockout. I forgot to record this, but I did make some proportion tweaks by enlarging the chest and head. Next, I'll be remeshing the model so I can start sculpting to get some of the subtle shapes in.